He watched the mother fold the last bite into two trembling hands as if it were the most dangerous thing in the world. Because to Mara Delgado, that single plate of fried potatoes and half-scrambled eggs was everything between her children and a night with no heat. Gabe Rourke felt his throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with cold air, and everything to do with recognition. The same careful arithmetic, the same private hunger that calculated how to keep people breathing through a night of sharp edges. He rode past the diner slow enough to see the way the two boys, one with his hair sticking up like a defiant hedgehog, the other solemn beyond his 8 years, leaned toward their mother, small bodies hunched like they were afraid the world would take the food back. There was grit in the corners of Mara's eyes and a stubbornness in her jaw that said she had chosen this poverty like a vow. Gabe felt something older than his iron will unclench. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The Harley's engine was a low cathedral hymn as he coasted past the neon sign that only flickered between the hours when the highway was quieter. Gabe's leather jacket was a map of scars and club patches, his hair cropped close to his skull, his hands large enough to close around the world. For 32 years, his life had been simple and brutal. Ride fast, keep the brothers safe, make decisions that had no room for sentiment. He wore presidency like armor, gold letters over black, the weight of expectation pressed into the shoulders of a man who had learned to hold the line. But tonight, the weight shifted because of a woman who would not let charity be humiliating. He killed the engine beyond the diner's gravel lot and listened to the rain start in a soft, hesitant percussion. It felt obscene to park, to stand exposed, among the flicker of moth-eaten booths and a jukebox that had a permanent fondness for old rock ballads. He could have left, move on, as he had to do with the rest of the town's small tragedies. Club politics required emotional economy. Attachments were liabilities. But something in him, call it memory, call it the ghost of a brother who had once shown him how to hold a baby without flinching, made him cross the street. Mara watched him come and did not flinch either. She had learned the hard way not to navigate the world with fear. Fear wasted too much energy. Still, she glanced down at the boys instinctively. Tommy, 6, who liked to ask questions about the highway, and Mateo, 8, who guarded his brother's small mouth with a fierce concentration. The diner's fluorescent light did them no favors. It made the boys' cheeks look raw and painted the mother's face a muted map of lines. Mara had a presence that was unadorned. No makeup to hide the edges, no pretense, just a mother who carried her heart where others hid it. When Gabe opened the door, the bell sounded small and polite. It was a sound that made Mara half smile because she loved small, ordinary noises. "You okay?" he said, voice low but not of threat. It had the soft cadence of someone used to holding command without breaking what he needed to command. The other men of his chapter could have spoken the same words, and it would have been a wound. Gabe's question, though, was a plain offer. She looked him over. Tattoos, the president patch glaring like a warning, size that suggested he could move the world if he wanted to. She saw his eyes, surprising in their color, not raw black as the leather, but a stormy green that softened when it met hers. Mara closed her hand over the plate as if to make sure it would not fly away. "We're fine." The word was small and muffled with pride. That pride had kept her alive since Daniel's truck left him on a rain-slick road 2 years earlier, taken by a rival crew's crossfire he had never been able to dodge. She'd learned to keep the boys fed and the rent overdue and her heart in place with a steady hand. Asking for help had been a quarrel she could not afford to lose. Gabe sat in the booth opposite them, the vinyl hissing under his weight. He could have sat anywhere. He sat where he could see their hands, where he could see how quick Mara's fingers moved to cover a scrape on Mateo's knuckle, where he could feel the ease they had with each other and the way they moved like a single unit stitched together with need. The diner smelled of coffee, grease, and lemon-scented disinfectant that made his head swim. The world beyond the windows was a smear of rain and highway reflection. He listened while the boys argued over who got the last fry, and he felt something thaw in the old war ice in his chest. "We're not taking charity," Mara said, before he could speak, and there was the note of something Gabe respected: boundaries. "I work double shifts. I save. We make do." Her voice was steady, but later he would learn it was practiced at keeping the world from hearing the tremors. Gabe nodded. "I can help." Discreetly. He kept his offer stripped of grandiosity.
He hadn't come to the diner wearing the white knight banners. Protection, a job, a lift home, he could offer all of these without the kind of entangling attention she feared. It was how he'd done favors before. The club had hands that reached quietly into necessary places. No speeches, no social media, no strings attached, unless one of his red line rules, threats to the club, betrayal, debts that touched their business, were crossed. Mara's eyes narrowed. She didn't flinch from the offer, but she carried the skepticism of someone who had learned that help often came with price tags. "You're a brain man?" Tommy asked, tilting his head like a small, ferocious old man.
Gabe chuckled, and it was an odd sound coming from his chest, warm and human. "I know how to move parts. I know how to make sure engines don't cry in the middle of the night." The boys were immediately taken. Tommy's question became 100 more. Mara watched them reclaim some of their levity, and she looked at Gabe with an expression that was both grateful and carefully measured. "If you insist," she said. He offered more than he intended. "I can put you on the payroll. Deliveries, mornings, safe money." He kept his voice neutral, experienced in giving things people could accept with dignity. Anytime she wanted out, he'd find another quiet way to help. But what he did not say, the thing that made his chest both sharper with want and heavier with risk, was that once he saw her resolve, once he watched her protect her boys like a pit bull, he wanted to keep them safe for reasons much deeper than duty. The first nights after she started delivering parts, Mara sat on the back of a club truck, the smell of oil and chrome a new second skin. The brothers eyed her with a mix of curiosity and the practical calculus of a tribe watching a newcomer. There were rules at the Viper's Den clubhouse, where the chapter met in the skeleton hours, about women and attachments. A president's vulnerability bled into liabilities. The elders had whispered as Gabe had told them of the job. Keep her safe. Watch the family. But their voices held warning, soft-knuckled men who'd learned how love could make a leader reckless. Mara learned quickly to read the arc of those warnings. She kept her chin up when men let their gazes linger. She kept her mouth shut when questions sniffed too close to the past. But she did not trust easily. Her late husband had run with men who mixed profit and violence like they were the same coin. When Daniel died, so did the illusions that money would always appear when you needed it. Debts remained in his name like hungry shadows. Mara had been keeping many plates spinning. School lunches, rent, a funeral paid him the layaway plan. The job Gabe offered was a bridge she had not expected, and it terrified her and enticed her in equal measure. Between deliveries and brief conversations over the hood of trucks, they began to thread small familiarities. A shared cigarette behind the garage that tasted like burnt sugar and apology. A rainy afternoon when Gabe taught Mateo how to change a flat with a patient hand that trembled only once. A late-night run when Gabe ordered coffee in a voice that thought about warmth like it was a contraband. When the boys pronounced Gabe's name with an easy, comforted cadence, something in Gabe tightened and then stretched in a way he had not allowed in years. But the chapter could not be separated from the world that watched them. Territory maps, rival clubs with ink and teeth, a new businessman in town who smiled on city councils but delivered muscle for others at night. There were whispers about the man who had bought the old port warehouse and cleaned up his public record with donations and appearances. A man who smelled of perfume and law degrees, but had a clean pair of boots that covered dirt only the county prosecutor would smell. Gabe knew how quickly a neighbor could become an enemy when lines crossed. He also knew how quickly an attachment could be used to make him break code. If anything came spilling out, Gabe's position, his brother's commerce, Mara and her boys would be in the crosshairs. He thought of the club code like scripture. Do not bring outsiders into the fold. Do not let family distract the mission. Do not let compassion cloud judgment. The code had kept his brothers alive through hits, through raids, through the cold indifference of a justice system that favored paper over people. But the code was written before Mara, before two boys who would wave at him like they'd known him forever, and before the late night when he stood on her porch and watched Matthew sleep like a small, weary god. Their fragile peace lasted on the scale of a held breath. Then, on a Tuesday when the town smelled of rain and diesel, whispers found a shape. A photograph from a social media post, an old flame of a prospect, stupid and proud, had posted an image of Gabe's truck in front of the diner. It was meaningless to anyone who understood the mundane, until it wasn't. In moments, the photo spun into the hands of those who liked to map uses, rivals, the businessman with the lawyer shoes, even a federal informant with an ear for trouble. The picture said, without words, that the president frequented the diner, that the president's truck had stopped where a mother with 2 kids ate on the cheap, that someone with leverage could make links no one wanted.
When Gabe learned the photo had been shared around, he felt an animal alarm that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the small people under his protection. He called a meeting in the back room of the den. Men with hands like grapefruits and faces carved by nicotine answered. "We got exposure," he told them. The word had the weight of a stone. Photo outside the diner. The men's reactions were a study in controlled violence, the kind of anger that smelled like strategy. "Protect the woman," muttered one elder, his voice a dry creak. "Don't be reckless, Gabe." It was not a reprimand so much as a map of fear. Love was the loosest fuse in their lives. If he let it light uncontrolled, it could burn the chapter. Gabe listened, palms flat on the table, and for a moment felt the whole of his life fork. He could tighten the perimeter, pull Mara and the boys into a bunker of secrecy and provision, and in doing so he would submit them to scrutiny they had never asked for. He could pull away and keep the chapter safe, but lose the small, soft thing that had already begun to reshuffle his priorities.
Or he could run the risk of both worlds, open his heart and his club to danger, and trust that love, when armored by loyalty, could armor back. He rode out that night under a sky the color of a bruise, and the highway hummed like a body waiting for an answer. Mara handed him an envelope of directions and a plastic cup of coffee. She did not take his hand. Neither of them liked unnecessary grand gestures. Instead, they held a look that carried 1,000 unspoken bargains: protection for dignity, work for secrecy, a life for something like hope. Gabe started the Harley, felt the engine, and thought of the boys, asleep now in a house that had shuttered windows and a thin heater. The dilemma his brothers named as liability was, in his chest, a choice between keeping his code and keeping a family that had already taught him how to love with a fist closed around saving them. He had always been a man who knew how to decide for many. This decision, whether to let himself love or to let the club remain absolute, felt like the first time he was choosing for himself. The next morning, the diner smelled like bacon and resolve. Mara moved through the narrow space with a practiced economy, coffee pots refilled, the steam hood rattling, a playlist of old rock spun low so it didn't intrude on anyone's hard day. The boys were at the counter, a wad of napkins between them like treasure maps, eyes bright with the secret of Gabe's quiet arrival the night before. He'd left a small stack of bills folded into a paper towel, slipped into the boy's lighter pocket when no one looked. It wasn't charity, it was a transaction negotiated with dignity. They'd found it under the sugar jar and had spent the afternoon swapping who would buy the next candy bar, voices hushed with ceremonious gratitude. When Mara slid a plate toward them, Gabe lingered in the threshold like another shadow that belonged to the place. He wasn't supposed to be here 2 mornings straight. The club had rules that measured a leader not by his soft spots but by how little he displayed them. Yet he wanted to be present in the small rituals that stitched a life together, the way she split pancakes without thinking, how Tommy tucked a wayward curl behind his ear like a private adult gesture, how Mateo counted fries as if they were currency. "You sleep?" Mara asked, not meaning to pry but needing something to say that wasn't about the job or the boys or the precarious math of rent. Enough. He sat on a stool, knees almost touching the counter. His jacket carried the smell of the road, tar, rubber, the faint ghost of gun oil. He took a sip of coffee that had been handed to him before he asked for it, because in places like this the gestures came fast and practical. He watched Mara watch the boys, and he felt the ache in his sternum like an old bruise that never quite faded. "I don't want you doing things for us that make you," she began, then stopped. The diner had taught her the difference between words that made people feel smaller and words that made things complicated. She chose careful. "I don't want you wasting yourself." Gabe's laugh was soft. Waste isn't a word in our vocabulary. He said it without the defensiveness a younger man might have shown. He had never been wasteful. He'd been specific, surgical in both mercy and violence. But in private, in the reverberation of his own quiet, the worry of what he might be becoming made him clumsy. "You don't have to tell your club about us," Mara added, before he could explain. "I can keep it. For now, if it's safer." He studied her for a long second, the rain streaking the window like a slow decision. "I didn't plan to announce it on a megaphone," he said. "But secrets have a smell, Mara. They attract teeth." He looked away then, mapping the room like a man who measured threats by sightlines. "If there's anything you want me to do, you tell me. I don't ask questions I don't need to hear. But if something happens,
If anything comes looking for you, I won't let it touch you." His words landed like a promise and like a warning. Mara swallowed. She had an inside life of stubborn rules. Don't go to strangers for help. Never let your children's needs define your relationship. Don't accept that your survival is an open invitation. Yet the edges of hunger and exhaustion had made her practical. If Gabe could make the nights less sharp and the days steadier, then perhaps she could allow herself a small ease. Allowing should have been simple, but the weight of the past made permission complicated. The relationship they were building was a slow, dangerous choreography. It moved through grease-streaked afternoons in the garage where Mara loaded boxes in a raincoat, through small mercies like Gabe buying the boys a cheap plastic toy that made them shriek with the sort of joy that split his control in two. It was visible in the way Gabe began to time his rides for the boys' bedtime, lingering in the driveway like a shadow waiting to ensure nothing crept past the porch light. It was visible in the club, too, in the sideways glances, the conversations that paused when he walked in with a gentleness at his heels. "You're soft for them," muttered Dex, a prospect who treated loyalty like logic. The words were small, sharp, meant to test. Gabe shrugged. "I know when to be soft. I know when to be a hammer." He kept his voice flat because the den could not smell indecision. But he also noticed the way the elders' faces closed like the lids of coffins. Their concern was not only for Mara, but for the map of their lives. A leader's attachments did not stay neatly compartmentalized. They smeared into strategy sessions, into negotiations, into the very things that kept profits thin and risk-tolerant. For Mara, the push and pull was more intimate. Little things unsettled her Mao in a way they hadn't before.
The boys asked if they could ride on Gabe's bike one weekend. When she said maybe, Gabe stepped in and said, "We'll teach them safety first. Helmets, rules." He didn't press. He didn't claim them as trophies for his toughness. He fought the instinct to own them as if possession could protect them. Yet the world did not care for gentle boarders. The same week the photo of Gabe's truck surfaced, someone started leaving flowers on the diner steps, cheap carnations wrapped in cellophane, each cluster accompanied by a note with Daniel's name and questions that pried at an old raw wound. At first Mara dismissed it as the lingering of a grief some stranger wanted to mourn. Then the notes became specific, mentions of unpaid tabs, hints of names that Daniel had kept in the dark, the kind that were meant to turn curiosity into leverage. Mara burned the first bouquet in the alley behind the diner, holding the flames with bare hands until the paper cindered and her palms stung. She didn't call Gabe then. She had always resolved to keep the boys' lives from being club dramas. But by the third bouquet, when a man in a suit, too clean for the neighborhood, appeared at the counter and asked about her late husband with a smile that had knives in it, she stopped pretending she was a fortress. "Thinking of getting into property," the man said, letting his eyes slide over the boys. "Nice spot for a diner. Shame about the competition." Mara's spine tightened. "We serve food," she said. "That's it." The suit leaned closer. "Food and favors," he said. "You'd be smart to remember who keeps the roads open." Something ancestral in her rose then, part fear, part defiance. She squared her shoulders, hands steady on the cash register, as if it were a helm she could steer by sheer will. "We don't do routes," she said. "We do honest work." He laughed, the sound meant to unsettle. "Honest work doesn't keep kids fed at my prices." He slid a card across the counter with a city number and a name that tugged at a memory she had tried to forget. "We all have ways of paying." When Gabe got the call, one of the brothers had told him about the suit. That's how the world reconfigured itself when someone under his protection was threatened. He felt the temperature in his jaw change. He rode to the diner before dusk, tires making maps on wet asphalt. The suit left before Gabe arrived, a blue sedan melting into the highway like a practiced liar. He found Mara in the back, hands on a mop that she was moving like a metronome. For a second he looked at her, not as president, but as a man who had been taught to read danger the way others read the weather. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't look up. "I burned the flowers." "You didn't tell me." His voice held something, disappointment, a worry sharpened into a private ache. "You weren't here." The mop slowed. She resented the way he wanted to take care of everything. She resented that she sometimes wanted him to do just that.
But she also resented the vulnerability that came with accepting his help. "I didn't want a target." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his soap, the faint wood smoke from his bike. "You already are. People are making connections." "So what, you fight them? Go all macho?" She finally looked up. Her eyes were wet, but not with tears. I won't be stolen like some prize you protect. I'm not fragile. He flinched, not from the words, but from the truth in them. He had never been a man who was tender for the sake of heroics. He had defended his brothers' lives with exactness, the kind that left no collateral. Mara's declaration was an accusation and a demand. Don't make my life a battlefield marker. I make choices, he said quietly. Sometimes they hurt people. Sometimes they save them. He reached out and brushed a streak of flour off her cheek, barely a touch. I'm not going to make your life a war. But you will if you pull me into the den, she said, if you keep me close to the things that make you dangerous. There was a rawness in her voice that threaded through him like a seam being torn. He could see his brothers' worried faces behind his own eyes, men who had watched leaders become martyrs because they loved with open hands. The push and pull wasn't just between him and Mara, it was a negotiation with the very architecture of who he had been. You can leave, he said suddenly, the words tasting like defeat. It wasn't a question, it was a concession, an offer that dangled like a lifeline and like exile. Mara put the mop in the bucket and met his gaze with a coolness that made him understand how little he could demand. I won't let you make decisions for me any more than I make them for you. She picked up a rag and started wiping the counter. If I need help, I'll ask. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that some things required sacrifice beyond pride, but he felt the shape of a future where the price of constant protection was her autonomy, and he didn't have the right to take that from her. He was president of a club that had taught him to take for the greater good. What he had not learned was how to give and keep someone whole. Their conversation fractured into silence, both of them aware they were balancing on a silent wire. Outside, a bike rolled past, and someone laughed, easy, careless. The den's world rolled like a separate tide that threatened to pull them under. The tension between needing each other and preserving oneself tightened into a visible line that both of them could feel under their feet. In the days that followed, the club shifted its vigilance into careful, covert measures. Prospects were counseled to keep a distance in public, but to watch quietly in alleys and on rooftops. Gabe assigned men to tail the suit's sedan, to listen at the edges.
He smoothed over conversations with city officials and made an appearance at a neighborhood meeting where the businessman spoke in platitudes about development and safety. He sat in the back, the president's silhouette like a dark question mark, and watched the man smile and charm. It was a show of force dressed as civic concern, and Mara appreciated it and resented it in equal portions. She liked that he had not made their life a showcase, that he was careful in how he wrapped his protection around her. But she feared the club's insistence that her life belonged, in part, to strategy. Her worst childhood lessons, about absence, about men taking control when they meant protection, stung whenever the den's presence made itself known. And then, one night, after they'd found a message etched into the diner window, names scraped with a knife that tasted of interference, Tommy woke screaming. Someone had knocked at their door at midnight and left a rag-stained note, "Pay what is due." The boys clung to Mara like small anchors as she held them and tried to parse whether this was a threat, a taunt, or the continuation of a debt collector's routine gone monstrous. Gabe was there in 15 minutes, boots heavy, breath fogging the air. He took the boys without asking, carrying them like he could still possess the ease of safety. Mara watched him, fury and gratitude braided together so tightly she could hardly separate them. "You tell me," he said to the empty doorway after he'd sat the boys on the couch, the TV a blue smear they didn't notice. "What did Daniel get mixed up in?" Mara folded her hands in her lap. She thought of Daniel's smile, the way he'd been brave in ways that were foolish. She thought of the men he'd owed and the dues he hadn't thought to pay. "He was with the Wolves," she said. The name landed like an accusation and a history. Wolves, rival club, the kind who didn't hold grudges so much as collect debts like trophies. Gabe's jaw tightened. He had mapped the area's alliances and enmities like a man cataloging weather patterns. Wolves were messy, territorial, and beautiful, exactly the kind of threat that ate complications for breakfast. "Matt explains the suit," he murmured. "They've got reach." Mara looked up then, and for the first time she let herself ask the question she had kept like a splinter. "If you take care of them, will they leave us alone? If you take care of it." He saw all the things that question begged. The cost, the violence, the way their lives would tilt under the weight of his choices.
He also saw the boys, sleeping then awake in the corner of the room, and felt the club's code gnaw at the edges of his compassion. He was a leader who had always made decisions that cost others comfort, that leveraged lives for strategic outcomes. This was different. This was someone's pulse he cared about. "I'll do what I can," he said finally. It was not a promise of war nor of peace. It was a pledge that he would not leave them alone.
Mara stared at him, the lines around her mouth softening, the fear and the need twining into a fragile truce. "I don't want to be rescued," she said. "I want to be safe." Gabe's hand found hers, an almost shy gesture, as if he feared the touch would shatter what little normalcy they'd secured. "I know," he said. "So do I." They sat in the quiet while rain softened the world outside. The den hummed in the distance, like an animal on watch. The pressure from the club, the whispers from enemies, the scrape of past debts were all forcing their way through the thin walls Mara had built around her life. The push and pull had become a pressure cooker, and each concession was both a release and a risk. As Gabe left that night, he felt the old architecture of his life shifting beneath him. The brothers' voices in the den called for calculation and caution. His heart called for a protection that was messy and human. He rode away with the bars of light from the diner window painting stripes across his back and the boys' small faces hovering behind his eyelids. The choice ahead was not simply strategic. It would demand a surrender that had nothing to do with club power and everything to do with asking permission to hurt for someone else. A phone call from Dex crackled through the static the moment Gabe hit the highway. "We got word. Wolves moved a shipment through port. Unusual timing." Gabe tightened his grip on the bars. The wolves, the suit, the carved names in the glass. The strategies and the stakes were no longer abstract. They had become threads in a net that tightened every time he thought about Mara's hands on a mop or Mateo's small freckled face. Somewhere between the den and the diner, between the roar of the engine and the hush of the boys' sleep, Gabe understood the shape of the next step. He could keep the club safe by adhering to its code and pushing Mara away until she was out of danger, but alone. Or he could pull her closer, break the rules he had sworn by, and ask the den to gamble their order for the sake of a family he had not planned to keep. Neither option promised peace. Both would leave scars. But as the rain stitched the highway into silver and the town's lights blurred into a reluctant constellation, he felt the old armor loosen just enough for a sliver of light to get in. The question now was whether that light could survive the wolves circling just beyond the town's edges. The first blow landed where vulnerability lived, between Mara and the thing she protected most, her boys. It was small and precise, a neighbor's voicemail left for the diner that morning, an automated tone that told her school had called and that Tommy had been sent home after a fight. Mara's stomach clenched cold. She pictured Tommy's hedgehog hair, the way his face went scrunchy when he concentrated, and all the careful rules she taught him about not striking out, about surviving with soft tactics. She drove there in a panic that felt like a hand around her throat, and found him with a split lip and a wild look, as if he'd surprised himself with how loud he could be. "What happened?" she demanded. "He called Mateo stupid," Tommy said, blood still on his lip, eyes bright with righteous fury. "He said our dad was dead because he was a loser," the way it did when engines faltered or when rivals showed teeth. She did not expect the thing that followed. An old brother from the den, Dex, arriving at the diner with a face closed down by the kind of thought that measured consequences like hospital charts. He stood by Gabe's shoulder as though they'd always been a single shadow. "They called in favors," Dex said. "They want to remind you, the wolves, they're friends. They want leverage. Kids get attention in disputes. It's sloppy, but effective." Gabe looked at Mara. At her hands, they could roll out dough and also hold a plea. "We increased the watch," he said. "No public appearances. If anything shows, call us. Don't engage." Mara wanted to shout that she wasn't a piece on a chessboard. Instead, she held a napkin and twisted it until the paper gave in. "They called my son a name," she said. "They used his father to hurt him." Gabe's hand closed around the napkin like he could crush the threat into paper dust. He had spent his life making sure his brother's wounds didn't go unattended. But this trespass into children's rooms, names as weapons, felt like a red line. "They cross a line," he said, and the future in his voice was not kind. That night the den hummed with a low, constant machinery. Men spoke in mapping phrases, surveillance, cut routes, containment. The boardroom smelled of stale coffee and leather. Gabe sat at the head, his silhouette a calm center amid the tempest.
He laid out a plan that was surgical in intent, a show of presence around the diner, a soft word to a city official to move parking patrols in patterns that would discourage late-night visitors, tails on the suit's sedan. No blood spilled if it could be avoided. That was the promise he made to his men and to himself. Not everyone believed in soft answers. You circle him and everyone applauds, grunted an elder named Rafe. He had a face like a folded map, a voice like gravel. But these wolves, they smell weakness. You bring an outsider in, you invite a war. You want to keep your family safe? Remove the fire from your day-to-day. Gabe's jaw tightened. She's not an outsider, he said. The room hummed at the word as if it were an infection. You know the code, Rafe replied. We keep the den pure. Attachments muddle our purpose.
She's a variable. A variable. That word landed in Mara's kitchen like a stone. She wasn't there at the meeting, but the way the den treated her as a risk floated out of town and into the diner like a bad scent. Gabe could carry the weight of authority in his chest, but when his brothers spoke in mythic rules about purity and cost, those same rules became shackles tightening around his heart. Mara learned what variable meant the day she found a prospect leaning too long over her counter, offering condolences that tasted like edges. He was younger, green at the eyes, and practiced at charm. He left a folded note the next day. Contact info, a promise of assistance. It wasn't a threat. It was an attempt to buy access. She crumpled it into her fist the way you crush things that ask for permission to live inside you. That night she drove the boys to her sister's, a plan to give them a night away from headline whispers. Gabe called twice and left messages that shifted between terse and tender. On the third call he came by the diner at dusk, boots wet from rain, face hard. "Why are you doing this?" she asked before he could speak. It wouldn't be the last time she had to ask. Love in Gabe's world required interrogation as if to confirm consents. He looked at her like someone trying to read a map folded the wrong way. "Because I can't ignore when someone I care about is threatened," he said. "Because I don't want you to think you have to shoulder this alone." "You make the den a weapon," she shot back, "and then ask if I want to live under it." The accusation cut him in ways more precise than any blade. He'd lived under a club code that had allowed him to believe he was doing right by ordering iron-fisted protection. The truth that hit him was simpler and uglier. Protection that stripped autonomy wasn't protection at all. It was ownership. "You think I don't know what I do?" he asked, the voice small for a man used to being loud. "I've made choices that—" He stopped. Because the sentence was too wide to finish, and because confessing the breadth of his past sins would not make this moment easier. "You killed someone," she said then, not as a question but as a ripped-open memory. She'd heard stories in town, rumors braided with fact, that Gabe had once pulled the trigger in a judgment that cost an innocent a life. People turned such things into folklore, a president who weighed lives like coins. The boys, the diners, the slow lives, now they sat against a backdrop that included the possibility that the man trying to save them had hands stained with another family's grief. Gabe's face collapsed into something raw and real. He hadn't volunteered the truth because he had shielded himself with duty for so long that the confession felt like a risk to his command. But secrets have weight until release. The room between them had been piling with them, and now it had to be emptied or it would explode. "Yes," he admitted, "a long time ago. He exhaled. The admission was both relief and weapon. We were at war. I made a choice. It cost someone who shouldn't have died. Mara's silence was a living thing. She had chosen grief with Daniel the way other people chose safety. Her husband's recklessness had taken him. Gabe's past acted as a mirror that flashed possibilities she had spent years trying not to imagine. That this man, the one who warmed the boys with small, steady rituals, was also the kind of man whose violence had once moved like policy. How could she trust a protector whose history included killing an innocent? How could she accept shelter from anyone whose hands had known that shape? "You were judged by your code," she said finally. "But I don't live by your code. I live by mine. And my code says, don't let a man's bast make my children pray." He looked like he would argue, but in his eyes she saw a fear that wasn't bravado, the fear that love might require confession and consequence, pain offered up without the neat control of a clubroom order. "If that's what it takes," he said, "I can talk to Rafe. I can explain. I can—" "Explain what?" she cut through. "That a man with a killer's hands stands watch over my kitchen table? That your protection is actually threat management?"
I can't let my boys live under an arrangement that could turn them into currency." Her words were a fracture and a plea. They split something open in Gabe, the righteousness that had held his life together, the old certainty that orders executed in the name of the greater good were infallible. He realized with the bitter clarity of a man who has written too many roads that his certainty had been a shield that kept him from feeling. Mara's refusal to trade her children's future for his code was a verdict he could not evade. He left that night without a promise. The engine whined into the rain, and he rode with the echo of her words in his ears. The den was a roaring organism. When a leader left a meeting without a decision, whispers slid like oil through the ranks. Rafe and Dex argued in tones that did not keep secrets, and a few men began to question whether Gabe's judgment had been softened by something dangerous: love, sentiment, distraction. Back at the diner, Mara folded laundry with the boys asleep in the back room. She thought of Daniel, of the debts he'd left that bled into the lives of strangers. She thought of the businessman who smiled civic smiles, and the wolves who took polish off leather to show teeth. She had accepted Gabe's help because she'd been tired enough to believe in rescue. But as the truths bled out and the fractures widened, she understood that rescue always came with a ledger kept by someone else, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel. When the first real strike came, it was neither an all-out assault nor a polite extortion. It was designed to fracture trust.
The diner's front window was smashed one morning, a single clean arc where glass had been kicked out, and a child's drawing, Tommy's, had been placed on the counter where everyone could see it, edges blackened with coal. Scrawled across the paper in a clumsy, angry hand was one word: sorry. The message wasn't for the club. It was for Mara. When Gabe saw the drawing, the den's response snapped like a trap sprung. Men moved with a sharpness that was all action and no speech. But Mara watched them and felt an animal terror. Her life, her kids' lives, were now co-opted into a war that had not been theirs to fight. She loved Gabe. She had let his protection in like a warm coat around her shoulders. But the edges of the coat were frayed with choices she had not made and could not consent to. She packed a bag that night and left it on the top shelf of the pantry, a small, quiet rebellion. It was not a fleeing in panic so much as a preparation, an assertion that she would not be parceled out as collateral to any code, club, or man. If the den wanted to make a leader of Gabe, it could. If it also required that she become collateral, then she would step away and take her boys with her. When Gabe found the bag and understood, his hands shook in a way he had almost forgotten how to be human, not from engine recoil, but from a fear that lived in marrow. He thought protection was a currency he could spend to fix things. He had not understood that some currency buys isolation, others buy reliance, and some transactions bankrupt the very souls they claim to secure. "You're leaving," he said. Not a question, but a broken acknowledgement. "I might leave," Mara corrected. "I might choose safety on my terms. I won't be collateral." He reached for her then, and she pulled away, not because she didn't want him, but because she had to prove that agency still belonged to her. Their fingers skimmed, and the touch felt like the last map before a canyon. Outside, the wolves moved like a tide. Inside, the den whispered about discipline and order. And between them, the fragile thing they'd tried to build splintered into sharp pieces, secrets unspooling into the open, a club's code grappling with a man's heart, and a family deciding whether survival meant acceptance of another's war or claiming a safety forged from their own hands. When Gabe walked out into the rain, the town lit the way like an accusation. He had one decision left that night: to order a strike that might tip all their lives into blood, or to find another way to make peace with the truth that the people he loved would not be taken as bargaining chips. The den waited for him to choose, and Mara waited to see if he would finally put love ahead of code, or if the code that had raised him would claim him back whole. The fracture was no longer just between them. It had spread through the den, through the wolves' plans, through the town's quiet streets. What remained to be seen was whether the pieces could be held together by apology, by confession, or whether they would shatter into consequences that neither love nor loyalty could mend. The rain felt like penance as Gabe pulled into the old lot behind the warehouse the wolves used as a front. He had not come with the den to start a war. He had come with a plan that smelled of compromise and cigarette smoke. The club's usual answers, guns, intimidation, a ledger bled into ink and muscle, felt too blunt for a woman who kept her children fed with patience and stubborn arithmetic. He wanted to hurt the wolves in a way that would make them understand consequence without turning Mara's knife into a battlefield memorial. Dex met him at the chain link, face hard but eyes softer than the prospects. A handful of brothers were tucked in shadows like watchful birds. Gabe's plan was surgical and dangerous. Expose the suit and the wolves' port shipments to the feds in a way that cut at the men who used civic masks to move poison through their streets. He could hand the problem to paper and courtrooms. Messy, imperfect, but it kept children from being collateral in an old-world code. "You sure?" Dex asked. Gabe smelled him, fear braided with loyalty. "Yeah." Gabe's voice was steady because the decision had been made in the small private rooms of his chest where love and guilt met like weather. He could send men to break bones, leave bodies as messages, and in his past that was policy. Tonight he wanted leverage that couldn't be twisted into murder. He wanted the wolves exposed, the suit's plans carted into light where lawyers and tapes could do what guns could not. They moved like ghosts, slipping into places that smelled of salt and rust. Gabe went himself to the port office where the businessman met clients in suits and law. He did not raise a fist. He did not swagger like a president who assumed he could scare a man away. He walked into public spaces and sat under lights and spoke in tones that had nothing to do with threats. He spoke in truth and documentary, evidence he'd had men take. Photos of shipments, invoices with the suit's company stamped in the margins, a scrap of a manifest the wolves had thought they'd buried. The businessman smiled, the smile of a man used to being untouchable. He invited Gabe into his office with a scent of lemon and arrogance. "You think you can come here and—" Gabe laid a single photo on the desk. It was of the suit's car, tires muddied from the wolf's dock, a driver with a face that borrowed from too many clean things. "This goes to a federal contact," Gabe said. "It doesn't call for a gun. It calls for a subpoena." The man laughed like a bell that would never be rung. Gabe's calm changed then. The patient voice dropped into something that had cost him before, the promise of consequence. "You can make a choice," he said softly, and for a second his presidency slipped into something torrential. "You walk away from this town. You stop calling up old debts under my name, or I put your business into hands that don't like smiling." He left as if he'd bargained and succeeded. He hadn't. He'd started a chain that would force the suit to make choices as well. Choices that might lead to prison, or to the wolves spilling open in fury. He had not asked for safety without consequence. He had asked for a shield that used law as a blade. When the wolves realized they'd been exposed, they hit a different target. They couldn't touch the president in full public war without drawing a net they didn't want, so they went after what they thought was softer. The den's perimeter, a few tires slashed, a windowsill smashed at the clubhouse. They made threats on social media with coy veils of civility. The town's deputy began asking questions about shipments, about invoices, about a president's sudden interest in civic paperwork. The den felt the pressure of two worlds, legal eyes on one side, wolves on the horizon. Gabe walked back into the diner with a bruise of exhaustion. Mara was there, under the warm light of the grill, an island of quiet competence. When she saw him, something in her unclenched like a fist finally letting go. She'd wanted protection that preserved agency. She had asked for a life that didn't make her family a pawn. Gabe had acted in a way that honored that request and risked the den's wrath. "You did it different," she said, not accusing, only noting the change. The diner hummed around them in its ordinary way. Pans, coffee, the low static of the jukebox. Mateo and Tommy were at the counter, coloring with a concentration that made them look like monks in training. "I tried not to make you collateral," Gabe said. "I tried to make the move someone with a badge could take and not our weapons." She held his gaze for a long breath. "You could have done other things," she said. "You could have made me vanish. You could have put us in a bunker and called it safety." He reached across the counter and took her hand, the gesture rough and human and fully unpresidential. "I could have," he agreed. "But bomber logic doesn't save kids. It just builds graves in new places." There was a sharp sound from the back, Mateo dropping a crayon, and Gabe flinched like any man who'd learned to flinch at sudden noise. The room felt small and enough. He leaned in, the leather jacket a map of past chapters, and kissed her there, quick, their mouths saying what words had been expensive with. Mara's hands went to his chest, not in surrender but as a test. "Are you here? Are you choosing us?" "Yes," he breathed against her mouth. "I choose you. I choose them." The choice wasn't free of cost.
When Gabe called the den into the back room later that night, the silence was a physical thing. He told them what he'd done and why. No blood unless it was necessary, evidence sent to a federal contact, not a retreat but a different battle plan. Some of the men bristled. Rafe's face folded like a condemnatory map.
"You took a risk that could have cost us everything," he said. "And what would you have had me do?" Gabe asked, not in anger, but in the compact of leader to counsel. Move her out? Let kids live like refugees in their own town while the wolves write messages on our windows? I can run raids, I can break bones, or I can use a system that will, eventually, nail the ones who hide behind suits. The den argued throws and counter-throws like it always had. Gabe didn't beg for their blessing. He accepted the consequences. His decision would not be popular, and in the weeks to come, some men would step away, convinced that a leader who let love in had loosened his edge. Others would stand with him, seeing the value in not making every enemy a corpse. The club's future would be rebalanced, and Gabe was willing to cede the illusion of invincibility for the fragile human reward of Mara's family living safe enough to sleep. That night when he rode to Mara's house, the air was clean from a storm that had scrubbed the town. He found her on the porch, boys under blankets, a single light spilling low. He sat on the steps beside her, and they didn't need words for a while. They listened to the hush that followed a risky thing done with intention. "You put yourself at risk for us," Mara said finally, voice small. "People will call you soft or reckless." He took her hand, the two of them small against the dark. "I called it right," he said. "I would rather be called reckless for choosing you than be right about everything else and come home to an empty table." She let out a laugh that tasted like relief and grief and something like surrender. "We're not a table," she said. "We're messy and loud and full of crayons. If that's your recklessness, then you're welcome to it." He kissed the top of her head, a president and a human, and a man unafraid to show both. "I'll wear the consequences," he promised. "If Rafe calls me in, I'll answer. If the feds knock, I'll talk. But I won't let anyone make your kids a bargaining chip." She turned then, and he saw all the sharpness of her past softened by trust. "And if you go down for choosing us, then I go down holding your hand," he said, fierce and tender. "But I won't go down alone." They didn't know what the next mornings would demand. Court dates, angry elders, the wolves' snarling comeback. They only knew the small private fact that they had chosen each other, and that the price, whatever it might be, would be shared. For the first time in years, Gabe felt the old armor shift into something new, not a shield against feeling, but a crucible that could forge him into a man who risked his rank for a family he had not chosen to find. Behind them, the den stirred like a living thing, its loyalties reweaving. Ahead, the town waited, its.